It's a pleasure to introduce you to Derek Fraser. I'm very much looking forward to it. I've heard so much about you, and we've met, but I've never heard you speak. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Never an easy one, the last one in the afternoon, but we've had 3 fantastic presentations, so I'm sure the fourth will be equally so. Derek is lead officer at Addenbrooke's, has a wealth of experience in chaplaincy, end-of-life issues, bereavement, as you'll see in his biography, and we'll be following on from the sort of presentation of now, looking at the pastoral dimensions of end-of-life issues and a good death, and is also lead here at the Federation of Theological Colleges, where he takes a number of students to Addenbrooke's, and many of whom are training for positions of leadership in their Christian faith communities. So, with no further ado, Derek, very much look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to speak. It's good to be with you. Can I just make a comment? I was aware that I'm being recorded, just really to be very clear that cases that I might mention are anonymised. Any connections that you might try to make to reveal any of the personal details would not disclose any patient data. You'll realise if you work in the NHS, that's a statement that is quite carefully worded. And I just say that for freedom of expression and case studies particularly. We're thinking about a good death. We've talked a little bit about extending life at any cost. And I just wonder who we're actually thinking about. Who is the good death for? Is it the patient? Is it the relative? Is it the family? Is it the staff member? Because there is a sense in which each of those categories of people can have a different response to the same death. We'll come back to that a little bit more. My direction of travel is to think a little bit about introduction and scene setting, pick up a little bit more about my professional practice as lead chaplain bereavement care lead at CUH, and then do some pastoral reflections around death and dying. A good death in hospital is perhaps important to think a little bit about, in the sense that a lot of our thinking has been significantly influenced by Cicely Saunders' work when she established the first purpose-built hospice in 1967. The comment was made about what do we give to our community around the baby boomers about death and dying. I think actually the hospice issue is one of the key factors. We've actually done something very distinctive within the UK around how people care for the dying. I think that's really quite important, because Cicely Saunders used to say, out of the medics who said there's nothing more we can do or could be done, her reflection and her initiative and her inspiration was, and there's so much more to be done. And many of you will have experienced and been with families who have lived within the hospice experience to find that those last weeks, months, days can be in actual fact immensely rewarding and worthwhile. One of the other kind of factors around a good death comes out of Kubler-Ross's work in 1969, when she very helpfully at the beginning there talked about the various stages of grief and how we understand that. I think that has helped us to understand some of the dynamics that surround a good death. More recently, we've mentioned already today, and that's part of the dilemma, isn't it, of being the last speaker of the day. Some of those kind of things are themes that have already been addressed. We have the Liverpool Care Pathway, which was a very deliberate attempt to see if we could discover how we might give patients in their final hours or last days some quality to life. Sadly, it became institutionalised, systematised, and thankfully was phased out. Nevertheless, end-of-life care is still very much on the agenda of the NHS, because when the Care Quality Commission came to inspect Addenbrooke's, And they've done that a few times recently, and one of it hit the press and one of it didn't. They were very keen to see how we enabled patients to die well. They were very concerned that there was a much more holistic way in which we might die and care for patients. I suppose the other thing around the care of a good death in hospital is that in actual fact, when we look at neonatal care and paediatric deaths, we've actually become much better at marking those occasions. Many of you will be familiar with footprints and handprints that are created of the little ones, that families can actually take something tangible away and remember their little ones. Sometimes when we deal with children as they're dying, we've actually created memory boxes. And again, tangible ways in which we can actually change people's experience of death and dying. So sometimes we've watched quite some significant changes within the hospital around dealing with a good death. A good death, well, historically we've mentioned already that it was something we prepared for. But there is a sense in which we've seen an attempt that we would rather do something than wait for the inevitable. And I suppose most recently we've seen an emphasis among some people who are keen for the best possible outcome, that we get on and do something than passively wait for the inevitable. And so euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are beginning to be emerged and are used as driving forces. I suppose it's helpful just to pause and reflect that the story underlying that position is that they fundamentally believe that we are determiners and possessors of our own life, that our time is something to be lived through, so death, when it can no longer be avoided, should be hastened by our own power. Let me suggest to you that that in some senses is wanting to avoid what they perceive as the anguish of death. They imagine we can control our own destiny. I wonder sometimes whether their sense of common humanity and understanding deprives them of something of the richness of living in community with people. And I'm saying that very deliberately because we've lived with people before who have feared the sense of death and wondered how they were going to cope. I vividly remember a woman saying to me, I can't walk the dogs, I can't do the gardening, I can't cook, I can't. It was when she hit my second hand and it was number 6. And I very carefully do that when I'm often talking. I got to number 6 and she said to me, I've nearly filled your hands up and I've got more to do. I said, you've told me everything you can't do. This was a woman who had been, the cancer was so advanced that she'd been bedbound. And I said to her, I just wonder who is behind the human machine that you've been describing. She said, but I'm the mum and I'm this and I'm that. I said, yeah, I know all of that. Out of that experience, we talked with husband and wife and kids. And interestingly, she went home, they brought the bed downstairs, they had big double doors. They rigged up a system whereby she had a device to throw the ball in the garden so the dog could run back and forward. She had a gardener employed for the summer. They gave her a pair of binoculars so she could check that he was doing it the right way. That was all of those kind of practicalities of life. But what was most encouraging, and it was only I got to know this because husband came back to talk to me about it a few months later, he said one of the most significant factors was that in fact Mum had time to talk. She talked to me about our life together, about our kids. She talked to the kids about what they had meant to her. And he said to me, and when she died, we ended up discovering we'd had more conversations that had been rich and rewarding than all the activity that she'd spent the last 20 years being busy about. And I reflected with him that so often we get absorbed in the doing of life and we forget sometimes we're actually human beings. And it's the being that is very crucial. So let me suggest to you that sometimes the agenda of euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, robs us of all of that. Because if you're faced with death and dying, you've got to address it. You've got to decide how you're going to live with it. I reflected, is time enough for love? And I think sometimes death teaches us how to live in the immediate. It also gives us the opportunity to live and love and be vulnerable. How many of you tell your kids, how many of you tell other people how much you love them? I had the very sad situation of my own mum dying, and just as she was dealing with a difficult diagnosis, and I remember us sitting on our garden swing in Leeds, and she turned to my wife and she said to me, "You know, Linda, you've been a super wife." And then went on quite extensively, not too far. My wife turned to me and she said, "Do you know, that's the first time she said anything. I always thought I was not the best daughter-in-law." It's taught us very carefully to say to folks, what we think you express there and then. You might never have another chance. I would never want to have a funeral, because actually all the good things need to be said when people are alive, not after that end. And I've conducted a number of funerals in my time. That's what I used to do for a living. Where do I live? Where do I work? Well, it's Addenbrooke's. It's busy, its pressure is high, the demand is unrelenting. The buzzword at the moment, of course, is patient flow. We have 1,500 deaths and 6,000 births a year. And if you then put it all together, you get a big system like that, numbers, a lot of activity, a lot of people, a lot of pressure. And we try in that context to create a situation where there is a good death. And that's why I come back and say, a good death for whom? Because some deaths are always awful, and there are some times when some of the staff do an amazing job and do it brilliantly well, and there are some very good deaths. My lived experience, who am I? I lead chaplain, I'm operational lead for bereavement care. I'm also involved in ethics, but also I want to just touch on a lived experience. I say this not to, in any sense, just to, lest you wonder, it's okay for him talking about it because it's his professional experience. It sadly has been my lived experience in terms of having to face some of the issues that we've talked of today. My wife, in 1989, was diagnosed with leukemia, and the treatment nearly killed her, and has been badly damaged through a cardiovascular accident. But now she still enjoys 5 grandchildren under 6. Great fun. Millions, thousands of pounds put into treatment. As you will be aware, leukemia treatment is not cheap. We were very gifted by a consultant who was willing to throw everything at it. Why? He comes from a Jewish background. His position, mums are important as family figures. I've always indebted to. A while after that, Simon, our son, was diagnosed with leukemia as a 17-year-old. He had a bone marrow transplant from his sister, which was successful. 10 years later, as a result of the treatment that he'd received, he died of a brain tumour. He died very young. His bucket list was empty because he determined he would deal with it. And towards the end of his time, when we were trying to encourage him, and I was trying very hard to encourage him for further treatment, I remember him saying to me, "Enough. I'm going home." He was Christian, he was very convinced of his Christian faith. He joked towards the end about he couldn't afford to buy green bananas. He and his mum shared the same black sense of humour. But we've lived through some of that. Whether that sensitises me to the situation that I work in, I suspect to some degree it does. But lest you wonder if this is just my professional world, the lived reality has also been quite risky. Let's move on from that. Some of the NHS works very well, but it also works when it's pushed by wake-up calls. You remember in 2000 we had the retained organs scandal. when in actual fact the whole question of how we handle the human body was very dominant. We had another wake-up call in the NHS when the Francis report was published in 2013. It was the Mid-Staffs inquiry. Robert Francis reported very carefully about what was happening in that situation. And fundamentally, it was a call for improved support for more compassionate care. He talks about a pervasive lack of compassion. And there is a sense in which, out of the Francis report, the whole agenda of compassionate response, good care was important, and how we might handle a good death was also an integral part of that. And the NHS and the staff that I work with have been really quite troubled to know how we respond to that. That's not because people are callous and unfeeling, but there is an attempt to say, how do we embed compassion into the system? I often reflect and show this kind of a picture as my kind of archetypical picture of somebody being compassionate. Here's somebody trained to kill, trained to work, be in a violent environment, showing something of who they are as a person. Compassion, however, is a way of looking at the world. What we believe about the world determines what we see and what we don't see. And kindness is different to compassion. You have to feel something to be compassionate. You just have to do something to be kind. And within the context that I work, compassion is very much on the agenda. And the challenge is to make each person within that system a compassionate person so that it works well for other people. Let me move on quickly. Coming into hospital can be quite difficult for some people. It can be difficult because it's unexpected. It can be because it's suddenly, they've had to just suddenly find themselves in A&E, or it could be out of tragedy or accident. And it can be at any age or stage. And it's all of those people that we seek to respond to in terms of, if it's going to be a death, can it be a good death? But as you know, hospitals are great places to patch up broken down or worn out bodies. And sometimes it feels like we belong in a biological garage, or we work in a biological garage. But nevertheless, there's been a real emphasis on people, patients as individuals. Call Me By My Name has been an initiative to sensitize staff to who they're dealing with. Treat me as an individual. I'm not a case number. I'm not the patient in bed 7 with a broken leg or whatever. And I suspect that one of the impacts of palliative care has been to continually bring back this whole personalising of care back on the agenda, particularly around death and dying. How does chaplaincy fit into that? Well, many people would suggest the chaplains are only there to deal with the religious people, with the God Squad, end of subject. If we were, we would be very quickly becoming out of a job, because official religion is declining in our setting. But within an acute setting, our agenda is a much bigger, broader and more expansive piece of work. Let me reflect it in this way. Doctors will often talk to patients about the pain that they've got, wherever that might be, and they deal with that. They deal with their concerns and give them pain control operations or whatever. But we also know that some of the agenda that people bring in is not just their physical dimension, but some of the existential challenges and some of the spiritual pain that they have. Now, some of my medical colleagues just tell me that I'm just only to deal with religion, and I remind them that are they simply, as Theodore Dobansky has described them, I'll give you time to read this quote because I think it's quite fun. Are we simply a conglomeration of transformed groceries? you will appreciate some of my colleagues, when I talk to them, well, presumably therefore you are just that conglomeration of transplant groceries. It generates quite a lot of interest, stimulus, discussion about who we are as people. And Dubansky's helpful because he reminds us by how do we become, out of such a physical input, spiritual beings. And one of the ways in which, as the chaplain, we tend to work with people is, yes, acknowledge that we're there as the representative of God and faith traditions, but we're also there to offer pastoral care and support, which is giving a unique perspective on the emotional, mental and spiritual issues of the patient. We talk about it in CUH as the psychosocial spiritual agenda, dealing with not the physical, but the psychosocial spiritual. So when a patient asks you a question, why, what are they actually really asking? What is behind that question? Is it a psychological question, spiritual question, or whatever? My suggestion, my surmise too often is that it's really people are searching for some sense of meaning, identity and understanding of what's happening in their life at this time, in this particular situation. And often we will therefore look at spiritual pain with staff. We talk about it in terms of the questions, a definition, a framework and some responses. Let me quickly go through some of that just to give you a flavour. Some of the questions that come out are fairly familiar. Patients asking all of those kind of issues. Other questions that come out as... Sorry, let me go back. And the bottom one is very pertinent because often people feel as though they are being punished. Whatever they feel as though they've done wrong, and sometimes they don't feel as though they've done much wrong. But nevertheless, it doesn't stop them feeling as though, because this present experience of suffering is so intense, they must be being punished. And what are the responses to those questions? Sorry, let me give a definition. This is a Cecily Saunders definition. Life likely to come to an end soon stimulates a desire to put things first. And a desolate feeling of meaninglessness. There we see Saunders giving us an essence of spiritual pain. Very helpful, because there I think often people identify with that as an integral part of suffering and dying. And sometimes in hospital that becomes very acute. How do we help with that experience? Well, often people's framework for asking questions falls into three kind of categories in my experience. Often it's about the past. They have memories, they live with a sense of failure, they live with a sense of regret. The present, when people are often very angry, feeling life's unfair and isolated, or the future, what's to be had. How do we respond to that? Well, I think in some senses you want to empathise. I often want to facilitate some of their expression and sometimes interpret for them some of what is going on and how they might move to adapt to the present situation. The case that I talked of the wife who was forever telling us of what she was doing, I remember reinterpreting for her, but what you're really about is being a mum and being a person for these people. Whether you can do anything or not, your whole sense of being is what's really important. She found that difficult to grapple with, but eventually she found it quite a releasing one. Husband, after her death, felt as though that set the context for the last few months, and that had been immensely helpful. I often say to staff as we talk about handling spiritual pain, how do we help people with spiritual pain? And that's the real answer. Being there, and being with there. Our presence is vital on a lonely road, and it is a lonely road that people are walking when they're walking to dying. Because often people will not want to talk to them, not want to address things, and people feel acutely alone. We talk about providing a secure environment and freedom to speak and good symptom control and all of those kind of issues. But more than anything else, it's being there and being with people in their pain. And the second piece that we often talk about is providing a listening ear, just so that people can talk and express and verbalise what's really important to them. And sometimes you hear some fascinating stories, and people talk very openly to me, certainly. I don't know whether it's because they think I'm never going to see me again, or whether in actual fact there is a sense in which, thank you, somebody's there to listen. And I think the reality is that if you do sit with people with no agenda, then yes, people are delighted to talk. And some also are helping with spiritual pain, is about preparing people for death, finishing unfinished business, reviewing their life, helping the family face their loss, and facing life's issues and mortality. I suggest to you that we seek to be compassionate with people, and that sometimes is costly. As chaplains, we do it inside of hours as well as outside of hours, and often it's the out of hours stuff where people are really desperate, and it is quite costly. And I found Sheila Cassidy's book, Sharing the Darkness, very helpful. She has 3 or 4 pictures, which are really quite powerful. Here she talks about the cost of caring. Here's the doctor with his mind out, engaged with the patient. Professionally, they're quite secure because they're doing their task. In the same way, the vicar is there, robed up, doing his task in his professional garb. But she goes on to say, the reality, of course, is very different when it's one naked human being facing another naked human being in the pain and the anguish of, there's nothing else I can say with you, other than I can walk with you along the road as you face death. And time again, I end up finding myself in that situation. We know that staff find themselves in that situation. It's vulnerable, it's costly, it's demanding, and yet immensely rewarding. And often I would say to staff, understanding some of that explains why you've had you're exhausted at the end of a shift that appeared to be not that demanding. Let me go on to talk about a little bit something of our practice within the hospital. Many patients die well. They feel supported, they feel cared for, they feel as though it's been a reasonable death or a good death. Others struggle and have questions and sometimes become quite angry. And when I first went to CUH, I remember actually having to speak for and account to my line manager, who was the complaints manager. They were not sure where to put chaplains, so they put them answer that. But it was quite interesting because we began to realise that quite a lot of the complaints that came into the hospital were not complaints about the care, but were families asking questions about what had happened. And out of that experience, we created the bereavement follow-up service, where in actual fact, we send out a letter to the next of kin within a week of the death from the ward staff, and then 5 to 6 weeks later, after the death, a second letter is sent out, inviting families, if they want to come back and talk to senior clinicians, then they have the opportunity to do so and meet with those clinicians some of the questions that they might have. It's proved immensely successful. We have about 1,500, or just over 1,500 deaths last year. 0.5% are hospital registered deaths, but we have about 20-27% response rate to that letter, which translates to about 11 or 16% of people coming in for a meeting to talk with the senior consultants about things. I often talk about it as putting the jigsaw together again, because in fact, we know that often these meetings, these meetings, a typical profile emerges of why they've come to return. They've come to ask some awkward questions, but actually what's often happened is they've been in hospital, the patient, they know they've been unwell, and then suddenly they die. And people are thinking, well, that was unexpected. Why, what happened? Did somebody miss something? Did I miss something? And we've actually found that that kind of profile emerges quite helpfully. But for the families, it's been very successful because it allows them to ask the questions and wonder what happened. We know that early intervention in the grief process makes a difference because it prevents them having complex grief issues accumulate, and some very honest conversations are possible. And we're reminded that openness really does make quite a difference. But I think it's also interesting to reflect here that sometimes a good death is seen and reviewed in retrospect. I had somebody who came to a meeting. They were very lovely. They wanted to know some questions. Consultant surgeon came in, and the wife said, "I've got 3 questions. 1, 2, 3. And you could see from her attitude that she was very focused, determined. Daughter was there as well. Asked the 3 questions. And she said, "How can it be that he rang me at 2 o'clock, and when I came in by 10 to 3 on a Saturday afternoon, he was dead?" Stark. She said, "It was made worse. He asked for the Daily Telegraph, the Saturday Telegraph, a chocolate smoothie and a banana. And I had them in my hand, and he wasn't there." What happened? Did you make a mistake? And the daughter had obviously been on the internet and was determined to show her information gathering experience. And the consultant, to be fair to him, said, "Can I talk you through what had happened? Can I explain the kind of process of what we had to deal with?" And out of the experience of talking about a tumour that had been removed and had been successfully removed and all the rest, he talked them through the whole experience. And they went away saying, "That was well handled. And yes, I realised there was a risk in him having the operation that he might have a heart attack because of an embolism." But the wife said to me, "But the fear and the other side, which is if they'd given them too much medication, he would have been paralysed and wheelchair bound, is horrendous. That's even more unthinkable." And for a man who was an active individual at 70 and a keen farmer and, she said, that would have been a living hell. So she said to me, "Thank you, that's been a good death." So I looked at each other and went, right. Interesting that when she heard this full story and the risks that were involved, why should she hear the risks that the surgeon had in his mind? She began to understand that everything had been done, but in actual fact, for them it was a sad situation that he had a heart attack. There was that risk, but in actual fact, all in all, the death had been what she described as a good death. Interestingly, these are the kind of key factors that come out of those conversations. When I said a typical profile emerges, what if, what, when and how, people want to know some details, and why the sudden deterioration. And then finally, final moments. Who was there? What happened? Was there any recognition? People were very keen to have those kind of questions and conversations. We found that really helpful to enable families sometimes to have those questions answered to allow them to go on in their grieving. Not that you want to say that there was a good death or a bad death, but actually it enables families to put the jigsaw puzzle pieces together. It's also very interesting because it's allowed the staff, some of the senior consultants, to say, "We did a good job there. We might not have got it completely right, but good enough." And then sometimes there are issues that need to be learned, and they're taken away and processed. And I've been very encouraged that some of the very senior staff in the consultant body have been very enthusiastic to help and support and talk through some of those issues with families. Let me move on, and I'm conscious of time, to pastoral reflections. I want to just pick up 6 themes, but quite lightly. I want to think a little bit about Kay Hirth's work on hope fostering, the 11 qualities of a good death that's just been recently published, and then talk a little bit about presence and passivity and themes from conversations. Kay Hirth did some fantastic work in the 1990s when she developed hope fostering factors and hope hindering factors. This list of 7 factors for me has been really helpful because it gives us the data from the interviews with people who are dying of what helped them as they were approaching their death. She talks about a sense of interpersonal interconnectedness. Yes, it's American, we apologise for the kind of clunky language, but it is about shared, meaningful relationships, a sense of lightheartedness, a bit of fun and joyful playfulness. Personal attributes are important in conversations, and sometimes an affirmation of worth is significant. Number 4 is an interesting one, attainable aims, directing efforts at some purpose. He talks actually about short-term achievable goals as really very significant. We had somebody who died in our village community several years ago. She was very poorly, young lass. Her parents were very distressed when she was diagnosed and terminal. And I remember on the Monday talking to mum and dad about what was going to happen in the next week or 2 or 3. And I remember saying to the patient, what would make today a good day? What would make this week a really good week? She said, I don't know, because I've just had some lousy news. I said, oh, yeah, I know it's pretty lousy, but what would be helpful? She says, what I'd really like to do is get out of here, not surprising, and breathe the air of the gods. Family, to be fair, were brilliant, and the nursing staff. And on the Wednesday, this lass in a wheelchair was taken out in car, taken out in a wheelchair and pushed up onto the gogs. She got out on the gogs. She looked out over what was a familiar landscape, and she said to her mum and dad, isn't this wonderful to breathe the air of the gogs? That was Wednesday afternoon. Put her back into the hospital and took care of her and all the rest. By Friday morning, she was dying. What was interesting, parents came back to me and said, do you know what? Even up to the last week she was alive, she was still living to the full. Short-term, achievable goals, yes, it's actually quite important. And when you think about it, what is our life made up of? But this week, what's going to be good for you this week? I'll tell you on Monday when I'm having been to Centre. And sometimes uplifting memories, recalling positive moments, can be significant. And sometimes dealing with the dying, it's super to be able to recreate positive moments for them of when life has been good and valuable and precious. Spiritual base, presence of active spiritual beliefs, yes, we do know that makes a difference in terms of how people handle death. I often use that agenda as a focus for conversations with people who are dying, as a positive, conscious attempt to engage them in reflecting together and getting them to express some of what has been really helpful and worthwhile in their lives. But we're not necessarily good at saying to somebody, you know, that's really courageous, that was really brilliant, and being positive in our strokes towards people. British Reserve, no, please, let's have it out the window and let's be honest with people. Sometimes people are making a phenomenal attempt at living life in a courageous sense, and we want to affirm that. Certainly I would see that as very important. That for me is a very powerful tool. There's been some just new research done in 2017 about the 11 qualities of a good death. Control over the specific dying process, pain-free, but again, we see again, engagement with religion, emotional well-being, a sense of life's completion, choices, and again, having family and present and saying goodbye, and a quality of life during the dying experience, good relationships. Sorry, wrong spelling, isn't it? Virginia will bear witness to the fact that this has been a hard thing to pull together this week. But again, a lot of that is not about physical care, it's about engagement as people, with other people. And as I've said before, one of the key factors in dealing with spiritual pain is the fact of being with people in their anguish. And to be with somebody, I think, can be very countercultural. We avoid the bereaved because we don't know what to say. I've had people cross the road and say to me, I didn't know what to say to you, so I just avoided you. When in actual fact, the bereaved crave, in one sense, your presence. Even if it's just to say, I don't know what to say to you. But we avoid the dying in the same way because we don't know what to say. When many senses, what they yearn for is our company and our presence. And I suppose in one sense, I think that's such a shame that we avoid people, when in actual fact the opportunity can be very rewarding It might be very draining for us, but very rewarding for them in terms they know somebody will sit and listen and talk with them. If we find presence a challenge, then let me suggest to you that passivity, doing nothing at all, is another challenging issue, and perhaps a more demanding facet of dying and death. There are times when some things like illness, disability, death are forced upon us and we have to deal with them, and that's when we're forced back on our character and how we respond. What kind of choices will we make? What kind of decisions will we take? And sometimes it's that issue that really is very thrust into the agenda. It's about that whole question of presence, consistency, feelings important, priorities are important, but sometimes the passivity is the only option often, and we have to simply stay there and be with people and be helpless. I hate being helpless. I hate sitting still. I'm a real kind of get up and go, and you know, sometimes families say to me, just sit down, Derek. I say to them, I sit down all day long at work and being with people. But it's interesting because actually Van Stone's work that you mentioned is very powerful in that sense. If you're ever involved with death and dying and that agenda, his theology there, his opening up of that agenda is very profound and insightful. How we handle the passivity, how we handle the presence, impacts on us. And I suspect sometimes that's why we run away from the death and the dying. Mary Craig, in her book, Blessings, written in 1979, tells the story of how she found strength to cope with the overwhelming problems of bringing up a profoundly disabled child. She describes in the book how she survived when the tragedy struck a second time. And against all of the odds, she found joy in the face of deep suffering. How? She went to work and help in one of the Sue Ryder homes that was looking after the survivors of the concentration camps. Her final chapter is perhaps one of the best chapters of the theology of suffering that I know. She talks, and I've got the quote here, it's such a good one. In the teeth of the evidence, I don't believe any suffering is ultimately absurd or pointless. The value of suffering lies in what a sufferer makes of it. In sorrow we discover the things that really matter. In sorrow we discover ourselves. The real tragedy of suffering is the wasted opportunity. And that's a choice we all face, how we respond to suffering in face of issues. How do you choose to live your life? I say that very carefully because how many of us know we've got tomorrow? My reality has been we never used to know what was going to happen the next week. And so you live the whole life to the full for that week. That is the way in which you live your life because you make a conscious decision. It's a choice we make day by day. I suppose time and again I find myself encountering people in the hospital who are unable to do for themselves, and all that they have left is who they are. They're stuck in a bed, often very damaged and unable to help. But in actual fact, who they are as a person is the crucial bit of the jigsaw puzzle, because they have an opportunity to choose what they will focus on, what's important to them, and what values they will hold as dear. I was speaking to somebody just a few days ago who said, I know I'm dying, I can't do much, but I could try and make you laugh. I helped myself, I pulled a really awkward face, and he said to me, don't worry, see what happens. And to be fair, the guy spoke, trotted out was the word I was actually going to use, 6 jokes, one after the other. And by the end of it, I was in fits of laughter. So were the ward staffs, because they'd come to join us, because they'd realised that this was his way of coping. And I said to him, thank you, that's been such a delight. That's been such a gift to me. And he said to me, I can't do much, but I can choose how I use myself to enrich life. Let me go back. It's Mary Craig, somebody else who said, suffering colours life, doesn't it? And the other person replied, yes, but I propose to choose the colour. And I think at that point, often, we're very grateful for some people who consciously, deliberately choose the colour, and in that sense, make the death good for themselves as well as for us. Let me just briefly touch a little bit about what's my role. I often talk about it as the trained pastoral theologian with a distinctiveness in engaging existential issues. Time and time again, the distinguishing feature of my conversations is about meaning and identity. What's the sense of my life? What's it all about? And who am I? And we often have the privilege and opportunity of talking to people when they're at their most raw. And sometimes that's really quite challenging, but other times it's really quite rewarding. Let me push on. We've done some work around looking at conversations. These are some of the themes that people talk to us about out of the research that we've done. Out of that, people are wrestling with issues as they face the end of their life. This is another graph about the same. People coping with change, the uncertainty of life, anxiety, fear, questions of meaning, powerlessness, isolation, hopelessness, sadness. Are they spiritual issues or psychological issues? Or are they really the core of what people are considered to talk about when they're right towards the end? Let me suggest to you, whether people are religious or not, this is their agenda so often. And I think, as the chaplain, I have the very real privilege and opportunity to speak into that situation and enable people to find some sense of meaning and purpose and worth. Let me just draw things to a close. Let me skip through this because it's not very helpful. Or not helpful, not in terms of the time I've got. Let me talk to you a little bit about Dave, 67-year-old businessman, very successful, who suddenly finds himself with Parkinson's disease. Mild cognitive impairment starts to kick in. Physical deficits are kicking in even more, so he needs help with daily living. He's been active all his life. His meaning in life came from being at work and his accomplishments. He's now unable to work, and he feels like life has no meaning. How does he make sense of his world? How can he cope with what's happening to him and put the jigsaw puzzle pieces of life together? How does he make sense of meaning? How does he make sense of who he is? He's never faced the issues before, and suddenly he's having to deal with them. Which brings me to this. Often it's theology in practice. You meet somebody like that, I don't have time to prepare the answers beforehand on a piece of paper. I'm trained therefore to think. And part of the thing that I've often done is to say to folks, so what are the anchor points to hold in that kind of conversation? And sometimes to go on and encourage people to think about what planks would you use to create a raft for the journey over the waters ahead. And sometimes conversations from my experience would be about building a raft with them that they might understand how they might cope with the next few days, the next few weeks, the next few months. I will be very unashamedly Christian at this point and say to you, my raft for the journey ahead, sometimes it's about living faithfully in the midst of unanswered questions, is about a God who is creator and source of life, a God who in his character is good, a God who is love as seen in Jesus Christ, a God who is very powerful, and a God who understands what life's like because Jesus came in human form, and a God who enables, equips and empowers through his Holy Spirit. And I've been very passionate about saying to folks, Christian faith is about living now. Not about hope in heaven, that's important too, but being able to live now a good life and a full life. And some of that raft is really quite helpful over the choppy seas. Is a good death possible for the patients, the relatives, the staff? Let me say to you at the end, sometimes good deaths are exceptional. And we do get it right sometimes absolutely brilliantly. Sometimes it's pretty poor. Sometimes it's good, and often it's good enough. But let me reflect to you, it's a very individual perception. We had 2 daughters who came in to say to us that to deal with their mum's death. She was 75, she'd been a widow for 25 years, and this one daughter said, well, she was already 75, so she'd done really well. And the other daughter, with a glower in her eyes, said, but she was only 75. Now, what had actually happened was the daughter who said she's already 75 had lived with her mum and through things, and life had been rich and rewarding. The daughter who said she's only 75, we eventually discovered, had planned the next 6 months to do 4 or 5 different things. And suddenly, she was robbed. And for her, it was never a good death. What was quite interesting was within the same family, they were having quite a good argument in front of me. And I said to them, we're happy to talk about what happened. And the one daughter said to the other, I think we just need a coffee and a talk with somebody else, not the clinicians. To be fair, to bless them, they spent an hour and a half talking to me after that, which was absolutely fine, but we didn't need the clinicians, because simply they were having to wrestle with, when death comes, and it comes sometimes unexpectedly, how do we handle it? And I remember reflecting with them, so how are you going to live today and the weeks to come out of the experience that comes? Mum's life. I've spoken too long. Apologise.
Thank you, Derek, for a very... We kept everybody, which for the last session of the day and a long talk is some achievement. So we have a few minutes left for questions. Brief, I would ask.
It's not really a question, it's a comment, and I'm thinking about what you said about your own loss.
Yeah.
And building the planks, and it reminded me of Michael May's Enduring Melody, where he talks about the cantus firmus of his life. But he's also very honest in the book of his own dying about the doubts and things and questions that he has on the way. And he keeps going back to his cantus firmus. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there are a lot of questions. In his book, Raging You with Compassion, which talks about walking faithfully towards the end, often with unanswered.
And this also sort of rather more factual question. 1,546. So, out of those, roughly how many just didn't have? Are there other cases where there's just nobody around and really it's up to the people just to be there, or how does that work?
Well, there were 14 contract funerals, I think, last year, which means that nobody turned up to own the body and bury the body, so the hospital did the necessaries because it's part of the Public Health Act. But in terms of families, we see an increasing number of people who are just alone. And I would have thought 5 or 10% of people have often no family there. It's very difficult to be judgmental. I was in an intensive care the other day, and the close family were not there. They'd gone away, and one of the distant family members said they just couldn't hack it. And I said to them, that's okay too. I caught up with the other person, but the family had walked out, and they said, we've just had one death after another, after another, after another. So this one, we knew how to protect ourselves. So sometimes it's difficult to gauge that and judge that. But increasingly, the loneliness is evident in people's not having folks around. I have to say, some of the nursing colleagues are they really go with the second line.
I think the lack of questions is not a statement about, it is a statement about what you said, but in a very positive way. Building up from what Dennis said in terms of your role and the role of the chaplaincy, what about those deaths unborn children and the helping the family cope. A friend of mine was at North Middlesex Hospital, where he not only had to bury many people who, on his own, as you said, increasing number of homeless, but also in terms of unborn babies and so on.
One of the kind of challenges that came out of retained organs was how do we handle the human body? And as you may remember, the retained organs was quite a challenge because people's understanding of identity around the body was quite muddled, but it came out that if you held part of a bit of the body, they felt very attached to it. That drove our agenda in the hospital. I'd only arrived in Addenbrooke when that was breaking open. And I remember some people saying to me, so Derek, what's a good death, and how do you handle it, and how do we deal with all of this, and where's your theology of death and babies and all the rest? And I remember going, it didn't tell me that at theological college. But actually out of that, we fashioned a very real attempt that whatever stage of gestation the little ones are, we will make sure that they are cared for and supported and buried in a way in which you would deal with an ordinary adult. There is no trajectory of what you do with little ones compared to adults. And I remember saying, well, then we just project backwards the whole issue of how we would deal with adults. Because this is products of human conception. This is little ones. It depends on how you understand that, and people then have a big debate about when did life begin and all the rest, and you think, yes, but come on guys, what's the bottom line? And the bottom line was that we would handle them as if they were people. So we are the ones with the bereavement staff in Rosie who make sure that all those little ones who die or are terminated are properly buried and followed through. So that there is a kind of sanctity of life issue that's carried through in a proper way. We've been very grateful because we take most of the little ones out to the woodland burial at Ardwick. And the diocese have been brilliant in terms of helping us with that agenda. And not making a commercial profit out of it. You know, there is a sense in which they hear that actually grieving for that is also important. And part of that, of course, is that 20, 30 years later, people come back and say, I lost my little one, and I wonder what happened. You know, and I think that is where sometimes the death of a parent suddenly throws them back to deal with the grief that they really never addressed in that sense. So, yes, we very consciously worked on that to make sure that as the moral conscience of the hospital, you know, sometimes it feels as though we don't have too much of a shout at Andrews. I have to say that this is important. I think people have understood that. I always link it with retained organs, and as soon as you do that, everybody remembers the scandal. Oh, yes, let's get this right. But actually, it's indicative of the fact that I think people want to get the dying of little ones as well as adults as good as they possibly can. I think there's a real driver at times about how that's handled, even down to the porters, because sometimes the porters will take the bodies down to the mortuary, and sometimes they'll say to me as I go in late at night, it's all right, Derek, we're just going down the different way. What are you going down the different way for? We've got a body, we know that we would see families or people, and this is not appropriate. So we will, follow the obscure corridors. And I just think this is where people are sensitised to dealing with it in a good way. Nice encouragement.
Just to say that a similar situation, a former vicar of ours said that we have to remember that every life has a beginning, middle and end. It's just sometimes the middle is longer than others.
I have to confess it's not my preferred option of having to deal with little ones. I think some of my colleagues, there is that whole sense of unfulfilled life.
Could I ask about spiritual pain? I work in a hospice, and I think that a lot of the time, by the time people get to us, it's too late to address the spiritual pain in terms of that we often have to use medications where we often know that actually what they need is a chaplain or someone to maybe pray for them, that sort of thing. I'm just wondering, should we be preventing it or trying to address it earlier? And do you think, are there earlier indicators that we're very good at identifying it, but helping it is quite difficult.
It's difficult, isn't it? Staff are not very good at being able to say, I recognise somebody's got a problem, but how do I get you guys in? And I often say to them, this is fascinating. In a medical context that's significantly hierarchical, you know, the FY1s and the FY2s say to the patients, I'm sorry, I'm not the best person to answer your question, I'll go and get the registrar, and if they don't know the answer, they'll get the consultant, if they don't know the answer, they'll get the professor. You know, there is a hierarchy, and I often say to them, and when you see somebody in spiritual pain, just say to them, I'm not the best person to answer the questions. I'll deal with your issues. I'll go get the chaplain. And I think that sense of interdependency is important, that we're not necessarily good at passing things over. But equally, patients sometimes read us very well, and I think sometimes we block conversations. And I've sat with patients, and staff have come, and the patients deliberately started a conversation with a member of staff, and they blocked it. And I remember afterwards saying to the staff member, why did you block the conversation? You know, the patient was saying, this is a bad day. Like today, lovely sunny weather and all the rest. Put the meal in front of her, this is a bad day. And she said, well, just eat your food up, it'll be fine. And you think to yourself, and I said to the staff member afterwards, why didn't you want to deal with it? She was saying it was a lousy day. She said, oh, is that what she was really asking? And I said, well, if you'd listened, the patient was actually telling you what was their agenda. And I think sometimes, you know, we're not good at that. Perhaps because I do nothing else but sit and listen and talk to folks. You know, you're sensitized to the fact that patients, in the first 2 minutes of a conversation, will really tell you some of the key facts of what's on their agenda. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm involved significantly in the medical school, to say to folks in terms of communication, the doctors listening to the patients will say to you, 1, 2, 3, almost in the first few minutes. Whether we take our cue from that is a different matter. But yeah.
I think on that note we will draw to a close, and I think what we've heard from Derek, but from all our speakers, is the importance of listening. And in a biblical sense, what struck me was the command in Deuteronomy, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Of course, the Hebrew Shema, which isn't just listening, it's hearken, because you listen and then act. And I think if there's one thing that we've all taken, and we're a wide range of people here today, from theologians and healthcare professionals, chaplaincy, a whole range, teachers, a whole range of people, is that what we've heard is something that each of us, I think, can take back in whatever work, vocation, profession that we do. So Derek, and Nav, John and David, thank you on behalf of everybody here for 4 absolutely fantastic presentations. As Bob said, we'll make sure that these presentations go up online. So there's been a fair amount of social media. I haven't been texting, by the way. I have been tweeting about it. So there's already social media interest in what you've had to say. And I'd also, for those of you who do want to have a few minutes reflection in the next half an hour or so, we have a beautiful, big discussion actually in the Woolf Institute, a quiet space, a big debate about what it should be called, a beautiful quiet space which is open to the general public, and it's on the basement. So if you want to have a few moments of reflection from what you've heard today, then you'll be most welcome. But on behalf of the Faraday Institute and the Woolf Institute, thank you particularly to the 4 fabulous speakers, but to all of you who have engaged with the conversations and thought about what you've heard and asked a series of actually excellent questions, which isn't always true with my students, but on this occasion it's true of all of you. So thank you very much, and in particular thank you, Derek, and our speakers. Thank you.